yoga chitta vritti nirodha. Yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of mind or the movements of the mind. One of my Sanskrit teachers prefers to translate nirodha not as cessation, but as suspension, right? So at first, when we're learning to meditate, there might be spontaneous and minuscule moments where the changing part of the mind, the fluctuating part of the mind suspends. And you're left with the part of mind or the part of consciousness that is not changing, right? When we suspend that which is changing, we're left with the unchanging, sort of pervasive, pure consciousness, you could say, like the blue sky, right? We like that metaphor of the blue sky because the weather sort of represents the thinking mind, right? Some days the clouds are moving over it, some days it's raining, some days it's, but behind whatever's happening in that moment is this clear, pure, limitless, pristine consciousness, right? So I want to read from this book by Murakami, which is a nonfiction book called What I Talk About When I Talk About Running, which, if you know me, I have no interest in running, but a friend recommended it and said it's not really about running, it's about having a practice of some sort, right? So it's very much related to yoga practice. So this passage reads, I'm often asked what I think about as I run. Usually, the people who ask this have never run long distances themselves. I always ponder the question, what exactly do I think about when I'm running? I don't have a clue. On cold days, I guess I think a little about how cold it is and about the heat on hot days. When I'm sad, I think a little bit about sadness. When I'm happy, I think a little bit about happiness. But as I mentioned before, random memories come to me too, and occasionally, hardly ever, really I get the idea to use in a novel. But really, as I run, I don't think much of anything worth mentioning. I just run. I run in a void. Or maybe I should put it another way. I run in order to acquire a void. But as you might expect, an occasional thought will slip into this void. People's minds can't be completely blank. Human beings' emotions are not strong or consistent enough to sustain a vacuum. What I mean is the kinds of thoughts and ideas that invade my emotions as I run remain subordinate to that void. Lacking content, they are just random thoughts that gather around that central void. The thoughts that occur to me while running are like clouds in the sky. Clouds of all different sizes. They come and they go, while the sky remains the same sky as always. The clouds are just mere guests in the sky that pass away and vanish, leaving behind the sky. The sky both exists and doesn't exist. It has substance and at the same time it doesn't. So I think it's interesting that he chose the blue sky metaphor as well. I don't know if he's familiar at all with the teachings of yoga or with Sri Brahmananda Saraswati and other yogis of the past who have used the blue sky as a metaphor for pure consciousness. But even what he describes, and be careful, because I know that sometimes when we hear the word void, that can sort of conjure a little bit of a terrifying feeling, like the void, the abyss, the nothingness. But in this sense, I do think he means it in quite a positive way. I think he means void in terms of that sort of suspension of the thinking mind. And he even describes quite well that moment when like a thought or an emotion sort of percolate into that void. But the fact that we are either in that meditative space or in that running space, in his case, the fact that we've created that void, that suspension of thought, means that when a thought does trickle in, we can actually, first of all, see it bubbling to the surface, and we can more easily kind of examine, like, where did this thought come from, and what is it about, and do I need to pay attention to it, or can I set it aside, or kind of more like that. So this idea of quieting the mind, or even finding the silence in the mind, is a bit the idea here, right? To kind of quiet down the chatter. This is also really related to the practice of nada yoga. Nada yoga being an entire realm of yoga practices that are involved in practicing deep inner listening. So many nada yoga practices actually do involve listening on purpose to sounds, meditatively listening to a piece of music, or kind of meditating on the sounds around us in our atmosphere in different ways, meditating on the sound of Om in particular, meditating on the sound of the cosmos, right? All of these listening exercises are meant to bring us into an awareness of the inner sound, or the inner vibration. You could say the cosmic sound, right? That thing, that vibration that unites all of manifestation, right? And our closest sort of vocal representation of that is the symbol of Om. So, I love Nada Yoga, and we could do, lots about Nada Yoga, of course, but incorporating listening practices into your yoga practice is quite integrated part of the JIVAMUKTI experience. First of all, the idea that we can incorporate music strategically into class, right? Not just anything, but the fact that you can use music to support the tempo of the vinyasa. You can use music to support the Dharma teaching. You can use music to support an uplifted mood, or an introspective mood, or a relaxed mood, or an energized mood, whatever you're trying to sort of bring about as a teacher. But it's not just willy-nilly. It's very, ideally done in a purposeful way to support the practice that is being offered. And then also the use of verbal instructions, right? Which is really tricky. The teacher has to work a little bit harder as a communicator, and the student has to work a bit harder as a receiver of that communication, right? And it is, of course, at times imperfect, but it challenges our mind to stay as present as possible. I was thinking about that in particular in relationship to doing either a podcast or practicing online, is that you really, in some ways, it demands that you stay a little bit more present than you would in a group class. Because in a group class, if you get distracted for a few seconds or however long, you can just look around the room, see what everyone else is doing, and get caught up to the moment. But if you were listening to like a podcast of mine or something, and the mind drifts away, or you get distracted, it's possible you would have no idea where we are in the sequence, right? So in some ways, it's actually a great opportunity for us to practice nada yoga and that sort of meditative attention, to really stay present with it in order to be able to make it through a fully auditory class without any visual information whatsoever. So ultimate nada yoga practice. But it does make a big difference in the way that our mind absorbs and attaches to the material, and it has that effect of bringing us into that more sort of meditative state. So I think even though it's harder, both from a teaching point of view and from a practice point of view, it's really incredibly valuable and leads to a deeper level of yogic experience. Other really beautiful thing that I'm interested in here is that we have, if you think about it, we have this paradox arising before us, right? On the one hand, we've talked about how meditating, we want to kind of quiet the mind or silence the thoughts or bring about a quiet in the mind. And yet at the same time, we're also using this language of nada yoga, of inner vibration, of hearing the inner sound or hearing the sound of the universe. So how could it be that we're both speaking about silence and quiet and thinking about sound to describe a similar experience? I don't have an answer because I'm a philosophy student. And as a philosophy student, I am prone to swim around in these deep questions rather than rush to answer them or to find the resolution in this apparent paradox that we find ourselves swimming in. But I rather love, in fact, the poetry of the fact that there's this apparent paradox going on with the two descriptions of practice that we're encountering. So something to think about there. But again, coming back to this idea of putting ourselves in the position of listening, right? So if I quiet myself down, either to meditate or to listen to someone or something, I'm putting myself in a position of receptivity. I'm putting myself in a position to understand either what that other person or thing is experiencing or feeling, or if I'm meditating, I'm putting myself in a position to understand more deeply myself and my mind, right? But that just that attitude of like quieting down and even becoming still in the body. Like, think about if you were wandering around in the woods and you suddenly thought that maybe you were lost somewhere on the trail. What's the first thing you would maybe do is become very still and to start listening. So we can kind of listen better the more still and quiet we become, the more we can hear, the more we can understand, the more we can experience of those around us and of ourselves and our own mind. I hope that makes sense. So meditation is a form of nada yoga. Listening in nada yoga is a form of nada yoga. Cultivating our relationships and our listening skills in relationships is also a form of nada yoga, in my opinion. So these things all relate to the beautiful idea of the sound of silence, right? Both vibration and silence, both hearing and listening and quieting the mind, right?